The bus rattled along the worn streets, filled with its usual symphony, coins clinking in the fare box, murmured conversations, and the occasional hiss of the brakes. Margaret Brown, carrying her well-worn leather bag, climbed aboard with a composed air. Her posture was upright, her steps deliberate. The rich brown of her skin glowed softly in the overhead lights, a quiet testament to the life she'd lived, strong, resilient, and unyielding. She glanced briefly at the driver, Joe Henderson, whose sour expression was as much a part of his uniform as his frayed tie. Without a word, Margaret moved toward an open seat near the front, settling in with the confidence of someone who knew her worth. She placed her bag on her lap and adjusted the brim of her vintage hat before closing her eyes. The bus lurched forward, and the usual shuffle of feet resumed as passengers found their places. Margaret welcomed the fleeting calm, the rhythm of the city outside blending with the faint murmur of the crowd. But peace, as she well knew, was often short-lived. "Hey!" barked the driver, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter. The bus quieted slightly as heads turned in curiosity. Margaret opened her eyes, meeting Joe's glare in the rearview mirror. "You can't sit there," he growled, his tone low but unmistakably hostile. Margaret's calm gaze didn't falter. "Excuse me?" Joe leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as they gripped the steering wheel. "You heard me. That seat's not for you. Move to the back." For a moment, the bus seemed to hold its breath. Margaret straightened, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of her bag. Her voice, though soft, carried a weight that demanded attention. "I paid my fare like everyone else. This seat is available, and I will stay here." Joe's face reddened, a vein pulsing angrily at his temple. He turned fully in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he stared Margaret down. "Lady, I'm not going to argue. Move now, or I'll have you thrown off this bus." Margaret let the words hang in the air before responding, her voice steady. "You'll have to find a better reason than my presence to justify throwing me off. I've broken no rules." Joe's frustration was palpable. He scanned the bus, looking for support, but the passengers were an awkward sea of diverted eyes and stiff postures. A young man with earbuds sitting near the middle shifted slightly, pulling out his phone. The faint glow of the screen suggested he was recording. "You think you're special?" Joe snapped, his voice rising with every word. "You don't get to make the rules here." Margaret turned her head, letting her gaze sweep across the bus. The passengers avoided her eyes, their discomfort evident. Some shifted in their seats, others pretended to focus intently on their phones or the world outside the window. Margaret's voice rang out, calm but firm. "If you also let him control your life, then he's already won." A heavy silence fell over the bus. The weight of her words seemed to linger in the air. The young man recording glanced up, his expression shifting from curiosity to quiet respect. Joe, however, was far from impressed. "That's it," he barked, slamming his hand on the dashboard. The bus jerked to a halt, nearly throwing some passengers forward. "You're off." "No." Margaret remained seated, her posture unyielding. "I'm not leaving." Joe grabbed his radio, his tone curt and clipped. "Dispatch, this is Route 18. I've got a passenger refusing to comply. Send security to my location." Murmurs rippled through the bus. A mother holding a small child whispered something to the man next to her, her expression a mix of unease and frustration. Near the back, an older woman shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. The young man with the phone finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. "She's not doing anything wrong, man. She's just sitting there." Joe shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "Mind your own business, kid." But the murmurs were growing louder. A teenage girl leaned toward her friend, her words audible over the growing unrest. "Can he even do that? She's just sitting." Margaret let her gaze rest briefly on the young man with the phone before returning it to Joe. "You're holding up the bus, not me." Joe slammed his fist against the dashboard again, his frustration boiling over. "You people think you can do whatever you want. Rules are rules. And you think you can decide who the rules apply to," Margaret countered, her voice as steady as ever. For a moment, the tension on the bus felt like it might snap. Joe's radio crackled to life, the dispatcher confirming that security was on the way. Outside, a few curious pedestrians paused to glance at the halted bus, their interest piqued by the scene inside. Margaret remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her bag. She felt the weight of every gaze in the bus, some sympathetic, others skeptical. But she had long since learned that standing up for what was right often meant standing alone. Joe turned back to the wheel, muttering something under his breath. His face was a mask of frustration, his authority clearly slipping as the passengers continued to murmur among themselves. The young man with the phone angled it slightly, ensuring he captured not just Margaret but the driver and the passengers around her. The mother with the small child finally spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "Can't she just move? This is holding everyone up." Margaret turned to her, her expression softening. "Some fights are worth it," she said simply. Her words seemed to hang in the air, a quiet challenge to everyone who heard them. The teenage girl near the back leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and disbelief. The bus was no longer just a vehicle. It had become a battleground, a stage for a conflict that no one had expected but none could ignore. Outside, the faint sound of sirens began to grow louder, signaling the arrival of security. The passengers fell silent, their eyes darting between Margaret and the front of the bus. Joe sat stiffly in his seat, gripping the wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. She had faced worse than this and knew the strength that came from standing firm. The fight was just beginning. Joe's fingers jabbed the buttons on his radio with sharp, angry precision. The crackle of static was followed by his curt, irritable voice cutting through the air. "Dispatch, Route 18. I've got a passenger refusing to comply with instructions. Send security to my location." Now, the announcement, delivered loud enough for everyone on the bus to hear, sent a ripple of unease through the passengers. Eyes flicked from Joe to Margaret, then back again. Whispers began to weave through the crowded seats, some hushed and uncertain, others sharp with indignation. Margaret remained seated, her back straight, her hands still resting lightly on her bag. The quiet dignity she exuded was a sharp contrast to the mounting chaos around her. Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the faces of those around her. Most averted their gazes, unwilling to meet her eyes. A few, though, looked back at her with tentative expressions of support. "Rules are rules," Joe muttered loudly enough for the nearest passengers to hear, his tone laced with frustration. "You'd think some people would understand that by now." Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying enough weight to cut through the noise. "Sometimes rules need to be questioned, especially when they're used to keep people in their place." The murmurs grew louder, a tide of unease washing through the bus. A young woman sitting with a toddler on her lap shifted uncomfortably, her brow furrowed. Her child fidgeted, reaching for the strap of her bag as she pulled him closer. She looked from Margaret to Joe, then back again, before finally finding her voice. "This doesn't seem right," she said hesitantly, but her words gained strength as she continued. "You can't just throw someone off the bus for sitting in a seat they paid for." Joe's head snapped around, his glare landing squarely on her. "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about. Stay out of it." But the woman didn't back down. "No," she replied, her tone firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I don't think I will. You're the one causing a scene, not her." The atmosphere in the bus shifted. Margaret watched as the quiet tension began to crack, giving way to something sharper, more pointed. A man in a suit adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "She's right," he said, his voice measured. "This is unnecessary." Another voice chimed in from the back, a young man leaning forward in his seat. "Yeah, what's the problem? She's just sitting there." Joe's face turned a deeper shade of red, the veins in his neck standing out as he clenched the steering wheel. "You people don't get it," he snapped, his voice rising. "This isn't your business. She's disrupting the route, and I'm doing my job." "Disrupting the route?" Margaret repeated, her calm voice carrying over the rising murmurs. "You stopped the bus yourself. If anyone is holding things up, it's you." The murmurs turned into scattered mutters of agreement. Joe's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. "You've got no idea what you're talking about," he hissed through gritted teeth. "None of you do." The young man with the phone angled his camera to capture Joe's increasingly agitated expression. "We know enough," he said. "And I bet everyone else watching this will too." Joe turned toward him sharply. "Turn that damn thing off," he barked. "This isn't a show." "It kind of is now," the young man shot back. "And you're the star." A ripple of quiet laughter ran through the bus, a faint but unmistakable sound of rebellion. Joe's glare swept the passengers, his anger barely contained. "You think this is funny?" he snarled. "You think you're helping? You're just a bunch of interfering busybodies." The tension in the bus tightened like a coiled spring. Margaret took a breath, her gaze steady as she addressed the passengers directly. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice calm but resonant. "This is about standing up for what's right. About not letting someone tell you where you belong, as if your value depends on their approval." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A teenage girl near the back turned to her friend, her voice low but firm. "She's got a point. This is messed up." Joe slammed his hand on the dashboard again, the loud crack silencing the bus. "That's enough," he shouted. "You want to make this a debate? Fine. But security will sort this out, and when they do, she's off this bus." Outside, the faint sound of approaching sirens began to cut through the din of the city. Passengers turned to the windows, their reflections ghost-like in the glass as they watched a security van pull up alongside the halted bus. The air inside grew heavier, the anticipation thick and suffocating. The young mother with the toddler held her child closer, her jaw set in a mix of defiance and fear. The man in the suit folded his arms, his expression unreadable but tense. The teenage girl leaned forward, her eyes darting between Margaret and the doors as they hissed open. Two security officers stepped inside, their dark uniforms stark against the soft, flickering light of the bus interior. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense expression, addressed Joe. "What's going on here?" Joe wasted no time, pointing a finger at Margaret. "She's refusing to comply. Won't move to the back of the bus, holding everyone up." The officer turned to Margaret, his face neutral. "Ma'am, is this true?" Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "I'm sitting in a seat I paid for. That's all I've done." The second officer, younger and visibly uncomfortable, glanced at Margaret and then back at Joe. "Is that really it? She's just sitting?" Joe's face twisted in frustration. "This isn't about sitting. It's about following instructions. I told her to move, and she's refusing." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. "She's not breaking any rules," someone muttered. Another voice called out, "He's the one making a scene." The first officer held up a hand to silence the crowd, his gaze flicking back to Joe. "Why exactly did you ask her to move?" Joe hesitated, his eyes darting toward the passengers. It's the policy," he stammered. "Priority seating." "For who?" Margaret asked, her voice cutting through the tension. "Because I certainly qualify as a senior. Or is there another criterion I'm unaware of?" The officer's expression tightened, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. He looked at Joe, whose confidence seemed to waver for the first time. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the passengers who now openly stared at the scene unfolding before them. "Ma'am," the first officer said, his tone measured, "we're just trying to de-escalate the situation." Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "De-escalation starts with fairness," she replied. "If I step off this bus now, it sends a message that this kind of treatment is acceptable. And it's not." The officer hesitated, the tension in the bus stretching taut. Outside, the growing crowd pressed closer to the windows, their voices muffled but unmistakably charged. The young man with the phone adjusted his angle, ensuring every word, every movement was captured. The fight wasn't over yet. But the balance was shifting. The two security officers stepped further into the bus, their polished shoes clicking against the scuffed floor. The older officer, broad-shouldered with a graying mustache, adjusted his utility belt as his sharp gaze swept across the crowded space. His younger partner, visibly less experienced, shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the passengers' stares. The older officer raised a hand to silence the murmurs. "Ma'am," he began, addressing Margaret with a practiced calm, "we've been called here to resolve a situation. We need you to step off the bus so we can restore order and ensure everyone's comfort. Margaret's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. I see, she replied, her voice steady. And what exactly have I done to disrupt anyone's comfort? The officer hesitated, caught off guard by the precision of her question. He cleared his throat and gestured vaguely toward Joe, who stood by the driver's seat, his arms crossed over his chest and his glare burning into the side of Margaret's head. The driver has informed us that you've refused to comply with his instructions, the officer explained. We need to maintain order on public transit. Margaret straightened in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her bag. Order, she repeated as if tasting the word. Is that what you call it when someone uses their authority to bully others? I'm sitting in a seat I paid for, and I have every right to be here. Joe snorted loudly, his irritation spilling over. You're holding everyone up, he barked, pointing a finger in her direction. This bus isn't going anywhere until she gets off. That's not true, a voice called out from the middle of the bus. Heads turned to see the young man with the phone, his camera still trained on the scene. You're the one holding us up, man. She's just sitting. Margaret allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It seems the passengers don't agree with you, Mr. Henderson, she said, her tone calm but pointed. The younger officer leaned toward his partner and whispered something, his eyes darting between Margaret and the passengers. The older officer frowned but nodded slightly before turning back to Margaret. Ma'am, he said carefully, we understand your position, but if you step off the bus now, we can avoid escalating the situation further. Margaret's expression didn't waver. Avoid escalation, she echoed. Is that your goal? Then perhaps you should be speaking to the man who decided to stop this bus and call security over something as trivial as a seat. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, a mixture of agreement and frustration. A young mother with a child on her lap raised her voice, her tone sharp with anger. She's not the one causing a scene. Why don't you ask the driver why he's making such a big deal out of this? Joe's face reddened further, his jaw tightening as he shot the woman a glare. Stay out of it, he snapped. This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us, she fired back, her voice trembling but determined. You're wasting everyone's time because you can't handle someone standing up to you. The older officer held up a hand, his voice firm. Enough, he said. Let's keep this civil. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her gaze fixed on the officer. Civility requires fairness, she said. And fairness requires accountability. So tell me, officer, do you think it's fair for a driver to demand I move simply because he doesn't like the way I look? The officer's mouth opened, then closed again. He glanced at Joe, who seemed to shrink slightly under the scrutiny. The younger officer cleared his throat. She's got a point, he muttered, his voice just loud enough to carry. I mean, she's not breaking any rules, is she? Joe rounded on him, his frustration boiling over. Whose side are you on? He demanded. You're supposed to be helping me, not questioning me. The tension in the bus reached a fever pitch as the passengers began to voice their opinions more openly. She's right, said the man in the suit near the back. This isn't about rules. It's about him throwing his weight around. That's exactly it, added the teenage girl, her voice quivering but loud. He just doesn't like her sitting up front. Joe threw up his hands, his voice rising above the noise. You people have no idea what you're talking about. I'm just doing my job. Your job, Margaret said, her tone cutting through the chaos like a blade, is to provide a service. Not to decide who deserves to use it. Outside, the growing crowd pressed closer to the windows of the bus. People held up their phones, recording the scene as the faint sounds of chants began to ripple through the air. Let her sit. Let her sit. The words grew louder, carried by the swelling numbers of onlookers. The older officer turned to glance out the window, his frown deepening. He stepped back and spoke quietly into his radio, his movements quick and tense. The younger officer shifted awkwardly, looking as though he wanted to disappear into the floor. Margaret rose slowly from her seat, her every movement deliberate and composed. She turned to face the passengers, her voice calm but resonant enough to command attention. This is about more than a seat, she said. It's about dignity. It's about saying enough to those who think they can use their authority to silence and belittle others. What's happening here isn't just wrong, it's a reflection of a problem that runs deep in our society. The bus fell silent, her words hanging heavily in the air. Even Joe seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form a response. The crowd outside erupted into cheers, their voices blending with the chants as more people gathered around the bus. Margaret turned to the officers, her gaze steady. "You want me to leave this bus," she said, "because it's easier than addressing the real issue. But I won't. Because the moment we give in to this kind of behavior, we tell people like him that it's acceptable. And it's not." The older officer hesitated, the lines on his face deepening as he weighed his options. He glanced at his partner, then at the crowd outside, and finally at Margaret. "We need to talk to dispatch," he said quietly. "Stay where you are for now." Margaret inclined her head, her expression calm but resolute. She sat down again, folding her hands in her lap. The bus remained still, the tension inside palpable as the crowd outside continued to grow. The fight wasn't over, but Margaret had no intention of backing down. The tension inside the bus was thick enough to cut, and outside, the situation began to take on a life of its own. The young man's video, showing Margaret calmly standing her ground against the driver's aggression, had already found its way onto social media. The internet worked quickly. Within minutes, comments, likes, and shares poured in, sparking outrage. The hashtags #LetHerSit and #JusticeForMargaret started trending, catching the attention of local activists who began mobilizing. A growing crowd surrounded the bus. People who had stopped to watch the commotion were now chanting in unison, their voices rising above the din of the city. "Let her sit! Let her sit!" Some held their phones high, capturing the scene for even more eyes online. Drivers passing by honked their horns, the noise adding to the cacophony. Inside, Margaret remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her bag. Her calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to Joe's growing frustration. His face was flushed, beads of sweat forming along his hairline as he gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing anchoring him. Joe's temper finally boiled over. He stood abruptly, slamming his hand on the dashboard. "You're all a bunch of idiots," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You don't know a damn thing about the rules. I'm the one in charge here, not you, not her, and definitely not the clowns outside." His words drew gasps and murmurs from the passengers. A teenage girl sitting near the back muttered, "Is he serious right now?" Her friend nudged her, whispering something under her breath, but neither could hide their incredulity. The older security officer stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Driver, you need to calm down," he said, his tone firm but measured. "This isn't helping." "Calm down?" Joe shot back, his voice rising further. "You want me to calm down when she's sitting there acting like she owns the place? If you won't do your job and get her off this bus, I'll leave myself." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her expression still serene. "You're welcome to leave, Mr. Henderson," she said. "Perhaps someone else can finish this route with a bit more professionalism." Laughter rippled through the bus, a quiet but clear defiance that only enraged Joe further. He pointed a finger at her, his hand shaking. "You think you're funny? You think you've won because these people are too blind to see what's going on." One of the passengers, the young mother who had spoken up earlier, leaned forward in her seat. "What's going on," she said, her voice loud and clear, "is that you're abusing your power because you don't like her sitting there. That's it. That's all this is." Several others nodded in agreement, their murmurs growing louder. Joe's grip on the situation was slipping by the second, and he knew it. He turned to the security officers, his desperation now evident. "Are you just going to stand there and let this happen?" he demanded. "She's breaking the rules." The younger officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "She's not breaking any rules," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rising noise. "She paid her fare. She's allowed to sit there." Joe froze, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a retort. The passengers seized the moment. A man in a suit near the back stood up, his voice steady and authoritative. "We're not going anywhere until she gets the respect she deserves," he said. "So if you want to hold up the route, be my guest." But don't blame her for it. That's right, added the teenage girl, her voice growing bolder. You're the one making this a problem. Another passenger, an older woman sitting near the front, pulled out her phone and began dialing. I'm calling the local news, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Let's see how they feel about a driver throwing a woman off a bus for no reason. The murmurs turned into cheers, the passengers finding solidarity in their shared outrage. Margaret watched it all unfold, her calm exterior hiding the quiet satisfaction building inside her. She hadn't planned for this, but it was clear that the people around her were beginning to see the bigger picture. Outside, the chants grew louder, echoing through the narrow street. Let her sit. Let her sit. More people joined the crowd, their faces lit by the glow of phone screens. A few activists arrived, holding signs hastily scrawled with messages of support. One read, "Respect our elders." Another simply said, "Enough." The older officer stepped back toward the door, his face etched with frustration. He grabbed his radio, speaking into it in hushed tones. The younger officer remained by Margaret's seat, his expression torn between duty and understanding. Joe, meanwhile, was unraveling. He paced near the front of the bus, his hands gesturing wildly as he muttered under his breath. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "They're all insane. She's just one person. One seat." Margaret looked up at him, her gaze steady. "It's never just one seat," she said. "It's what it represents. And what you're showing everyone here, Mr. Henderson, is exactly why this fight matters." Her words cut through the noise like a blade, silencing the bus for a brief, powerful moment. Even Joe stopped pacing, his face contorting as he struggled to respond. Outside, the chants continued. The crowd had grown large enough to attract even more attention. Nearby shop owners peeked out of their doors, and passing cars slowed to take in the scene. A reporter with a camera crew pushed through the throng, her microphone held high as she tried to gather details. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The passengers, emboldened by Margaret's calm defiance, began to voice their support more openly. "She's right," said the man in the suit. "This isn't about one seat. It's about how we treat each other." "Exactly," added the young mother. "And we're not letting you push her around." Joe's frustration boiled over once again. "Fine," he shouted. "You want to side with her? Go ahead. But don't blame me when this bus doesn't move." The older officer turned back to him, his voice sharp. "Driver, that's enough. If you can't handle this situation professionally, we'll handle it for you." Joe stared at him, his chest heaving. For a moment, it seemed as though he might argue further, but the weight of the passengers' stares and the growing crowd outside finally silenced him. He sank back into his seat, muttering something unintelligible. Margaret leaned back slightly, her hands still resting lightly on her bag. She glanced out the window at the crowd, their faces a mixture of anger and hope. Turning her gaze back to the passengers, she spoke once more. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "It's about standing up for what's right, no matter how small it seems. Because if we don't, we're telling people like him that it's okay to treat us like we don't matter. And I refuse to do that." The bus erupted into applause, the sound mingling with the cheers outside. Margaret remained composed, but inside, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't alone. The scene outside the bus had grown into a full-blown spectacle. The chants of "Let her sit" resonated louder, punctuated by car horns and the hum of dozens of recording phones held aloft by the growing crowd. A news van pulled up, its bold station logo gleaming under the streetlights. The arrival of local media was the catalyst that turned a heated confrontation into a breaking news event. A journalist stepped out, her cameraman following closely behind, their equipment ready. She approached the bus with purposeful strides, microphone in hand, her expression a mixture of curiosity and determination. A woman from the crowd quickly intercepted her, gesturing toward the bus and explaining the situation in rapid-fire sentences. The journalist's face hardened with understanding as she nodded and turned toward the open doors of the bus. Inside, the tension crackled. Margaret remained seated, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing around her. The security officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware that the growing media presence was about to make their job infinitely more complicated. The journalist stepped onto the bus, her presence commanding immediate attention. The younger security officer tried to intercept her. "Ma'am, this is a private—" "Not anymore," she interrupted, her tone firm but professional. "The public has a right to know what's happening here." She turned to the passengers, her gaze scanning the faces. "Can anyone tell me what started this?" The young man with the phone was the first to respond, holding up his device. "I've been recording since it started. She's just sitting in her seat, and the driver wants her gone for no reason." The journalist gestured for him to continue, and he recounted the events with a mix of frustration and disbelief. When he finished, she turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Brown," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "Mrs. Brown, can you tell us why you refused to move?" the journalist asked, leaning slightly toward her. Margaret's eyes met hers without hesitation. "Because there was no reason for me to move. I paid my fare like everyone else. This seat was available and I took it. The only issue here is that the driver didn't like where I chose to sit." The journalist nodded, her microphone still aimed at Margaret. "And what would you like to see happen now?" Margaret's lips curved into a faint, resolute smile. "I'd like to see a world where people in power don't use their authority to diminish others. A world where dignity isn't conditional on someone else's approval." Outside, the crowd cheered, their chants momentarily drowned out by applause. The journalist turned to the other passengers. "What about the rest of you? Do you agree with Mrs. Brown?" The responses were immediate and unanimous. "Absolutely," said the man in the suit. "This has gone too far." "She's done nothing wrong," added the young mother. "If anyone should be leaving, it's the driver." The journalist raised her eyebrows. "Has the driver addressed any of your concerns?" A collective murmur of dissent rippled through the bus. Joe, who had been standing stiffly by the driver's seat, finally exploded. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his face red with anger. "You're all just siding with her because it's easier than following the rules." The journalist turned her attention to him. "Sir, can you clarify which rule Mrs. Brown has broken?" Joe opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyes darted around the bus, landing briefly on Margaret before shifting away. "She's disrupting the bus," he muttered finally. "I told her to move and she refused." The journalist didn't miss a beat. "So, to be clear, Mrs. Brown is sitting in a seat she paid for, and the disruption began when you stopped the bus and called security. Is that correct?" Joe's jaw tightened. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he snapped. "I know how to do my job." The cameraman captured every word, and the passengers' expressions made it clear that Joe's performance was not winning him any sympathy. The sound of another vehicle pulling up drew everyone's attention. A sleek black car with the logo of the transit company emblazoned on the door came to a stop. A man in a crisp suit stepped out, adjusting his tie as he surveyed the scene. His expression was a mix of annoyance and concern as he made his way toward the bus. Inside, the older security officer let out a quiet sigh of relief. Finally, he muttered under his breath. The transit company representative climbed aboard, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He introduced himself briskly. "I'm Stephen Carroll, operations manager. I've been sent to resolve this situation." He turned to Joe, his eyes narrowing. "Driver Henderson, I'll need a full report on this incident. In the meantime, step aside." Joe bristled. "I was just doing my job," he protested. "Your job," Carroll interrupted smoothly, "does not include creating a public relations nightmare for the company." So, reluctantly, Joe moved to the back of the bus, muttering under his breath. Carroll turned his attention to Margaret. "Mrs. Brown, on behalf of the transit company, I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced today." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Inconvenience," she repeated. "That's an interesting choice of words." Carroll hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Before he could respond, the young man with the phone spoke up. "Inconvenience? Is that what you're calling this?" "She's been humiliated in front of a bus full of people." Another passenger chimed in. "This isn't just about her. It's about how drivers like him get away with this stuff all the time. Carroll held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. I understand your frustrations, and I assure you, this incident will be thoroughly investigated. The teenage girl near the back leaned forward. Investigated? What does that even mean? Are you actually going to do something, or is this just damage control? The murmurs of agreement were growing louder. Sensing he was losing control of the narrative, Carroll turned to Margaret. Mrs. Brown, would you be willing to discuss this further at our office? I'd like to personally address your concerns. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. I'll discuss this further when your company takes accountability for what happened here. And I suggest you start by addressing the behavior of your driver. The passengers erupted into applause, their voices calling for justice. Carroll raised his hands in an attempt to calm them. All right, he said. Effective immediately, driver Henderson is suspended pending a full investigation. Joe's outraged voice rose from the back of the bus. You're suspending me? For what? Doing my job? For conduct unbecoming of a company employee, Carroll replied, his tone icy. Now, please disembark. Joe stormed off the bus, his face a mask of fury. As he disappeared into the crowd, the passengers cheered, their energy electric. Margaret remained seated, her posture as composed as ever. She had won this round, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The bus doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and a replacement vehicle pulled up alongside. The passengers filed out, their expressions a mix of lingering frustration and quiet determination. Some whispered words of encouragement to Margaret as they passed by, while others gave her small nods of solidarity. She remained seated until the last passenger exited, rising only when the younger security officer offered a tentative hand. Margaret declined it with a polite smile and stepped off the bus on her own. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as she appeared, their chants of "Let her sit" evolving into "We stand with Margaret." She gave them a small wave, her movements calm and deliberate, before boarding the replacement bus. The moment she took her seat near the front, the cheers intensified, echoing down the street as the vehicle pulled away. The transit company's sleek black sedan waited for her at the end of the route. Margaret was escorted inside by a tight-lipped representative who gave her a polite but perfunctory greeting. As the car navigated the city's bustling streets, she gazed out the window, her mind replaying the events of the day. The faces of the passengers, the growing crowd, and the heated exchanges were all etched vividly in her memory. This wasn't just a moment, it was a turning point. The car stopped in front of the transit company's glass-paneled headquarters. Margaret stepped out, her posture straight and her chin held high. Inside, she was greeted by Karen Smith, a woman whose sharp suit and confident stride immediately set her apart from the other employees milling about. Mrs. Brown, Karen said, extending a hand. I'm Karen Smith, a civil rights attorney. I've been following what happened today. Would you mind if we talked? Margaret studied her for a moment before taking her hand. I suppose a conversation couldn't hurt. Karen led her to a quiet conference room, closing the door behind them. The room was sleek and impersonal, with polished wooden furniture and muted lighting. Karen gestured for Margaret to sit, then settled into the chair opposite her. I'm sure today has been overwhelming, Karen began, her voice steady and professional. But I want you to know that you don't have to face this alone. What happened on that bus isn't just an isolated incident, it's part of a larger issue. And if you're willing, I'd like to help you fight it. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. What makes you so sure I want to fight? Karen leaned forward, her expression earnest. Because you didn't back down. Even when the driver yelled at you, even when the crowd gathered, you stood your ground. That tells me you understand how important this is. Margaret was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on Karen. Finally, she nodded. I've been fighting my whole life, she said quietly. I didn't plan on doing it again today, but it seems life had other plans. Karen's eyes softened. Tell me about that. Your life, I mean. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. I grew up in a world where my voice didn't matter. At least, that's what people wanted me to believe. But my mother, she always told me that silence wasn't an option. She taught me to stand up, even when it was terrifying. And believe me, it was terrifying. She paused, her gaze distant. I marched. I spoke out. I lost jobs, friends, everything at times. But I never stopped, because if I did, what kind of world would I leave behind for my children? For my grandchildren? Karen nodded, her respect evident. And today, you showed that same courage. That's exactly why we need to take this further. This isn't just about you or that driver. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Margaret met her gaze, her voice firm. Then let's make it about the system. Karen smiled, a glimmer of determination in her eyes. I was hoping you'd say that. The two women began to map out a plan, their conversation interrupted only by the arrival of coffee and water brought in by a nervous assistant. Karen explained the steps they'd need to take, gathering witness statements, reviewing company policies, and preparing for what would undoubtedly be a lengthy and public fight. You should also know, Karen added, that this isn't the first time this company has been accused of discriminatory practices. There's a history here, and it's time we bring it to light. Margaret nodded. Then we'll make sure everyone sees it. Word of Margaret's decision spread quickly. Karen wasted no time reaching out to local activists, many of whom had already seen the viral video and were eager to lend their support. Within hours, a group had formed, their shared goal clear: to hold the transit company accountable and ensure lasting change. The company, clearly rattled by the growing backlash, issued a public apology later that day. A spokesperson stood in front of a cluster of reporters, reading from a carefully prepared statement. We regret the events that took place earlier today and extend our sincerest apologies to Mrs. Margaret Brown and the passengers affected by this incident. The company is committed to ensuring that all riders are treated with dignity and respect. The apology, though polite, rang hollow. Activists immediately called it out as damage control, pointing to the company's history of complaints and lack of meaningful action. Karen watched the broadcast with a wry smile, shaking her head. They think an apology will make this go away, she said. But they're about to find out they're wrong. Margaret, sitting beside her, nodded slowly. An apology is easy, she said. Change is hard. And I'm not stopping until I see the latter. Karen placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we'll see it together. As the group of activists continued to grow, plans for a rally began to take shape. Flyers were printed, calls were made, and social media buzzed with details. Margaret's story had struck a chord, inspiring people from all walks of life to join the fight. For Margaret, the whirlwind of activity was both invigorating and daunting. She hadn't expected to become the face of a movement, but as she watched the pieces fall into place, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer just her fight. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to sit down, stay silent, or accept less. The road ahead was uncertain, but Margaret was certain of one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. And together, they were going to make history. The courtroom brimmed with anticipation, the atmosphere tense as spectators settled into their seats. The trial had drawn considerable attention, with Margaret Brown sitting at the plaintiff's table alongside Karen Smith, her lawyer. Joe Henderson was present, flanked by the transit company's legal team, his expression hardened but betraying moments of unease. The stakes were clear. This wasn't just about one incident on a bus. It was a battle over accountability. Karen opened the proceedings with a detailed summary of events. She painted a clear picture of the discrimination Margaret endured and tied it to a larger pattern of systemic negligence. Evidence began to mount as complaint records against Joe were presented. These documents revealed years of grievances filed by passengers, all describing behavior similar to what Margaret had experienced: intimidation, inappropriate comments, and clear bias. The courtroom buzzed quietly as each complaint was read, the pattern undeniable. Witnesses were called, each one recounting their version of the events on the bus. Their testimonies painted Joe as a man who had allowed his authority to mutate into unchecked aggression. Passengers described how his voice grew louder and angrier with each passing moment, while Margaret remained calm. Several noted her dignity and restraint even as Joe's hostility escalated. When the viral video was played for the court, the murmurs ceased. The footage was raw and undeniable. Margaret sat in her seat, unflinching, while Joe gestured wildly, his frustration palpable. The passengers' voices of support echoed faintly, a testament to the solidarity Margaret had inspired that day. The jury watched intently, some exchanging glances, the gravity of the evidence sinking in. Karen shifted focus to the company's failure to act. She highlighted the complaints against Joe that had been ignored or dismissed, building the case that his behavior was not an anomaly but a symptom of a permissive culture. Policies meant to protect passengers had instead shielded a driver who abused his authority. The defense attempted to deflect blame, suggesting that Margaret had contributed to the tension by refusing to move, but the argument fell flat. The evidence spoke louder than any attempt at misdirection. Margaret took the stand, her testimony deliberate and steady. She described her experience, framing her decision to stay seated as a refusal to accept humiliation. Her words were not laced with bitterness but with resolve, drawing on a lifetime of standing firm in the face of injustice. She explained how this fight was not just for her but for the generations to come, a plea for a world where such indignities were no longer tolerated. Karen tied it all together, presenting the video as the case's linchpin. It captured every crucial moment: Joe's anger, the passengers' support, and Margaret's unyielding composure. The courtroom absorbed the evidence, the weight of the truth becoming undeniable. The judge and jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, the preliminary decision was clear. The court ruled in Margaret's favor, recognizing her right to seek damages and condemning the transit company for its negligence. But the fight was far from over. The company's representatives signaled their intent to appeal, hinting at a prolonged battle ahead. For Margaret, the ruling was a step forward but a reminder that the road to justice often demanded endurance. The transit company wasted no time attempting to salvage its reputation. Slick advertisements began appearing on buses and social media, touting their commitment to inclusivity and equality. The company's logo now accompanied slogans like, "A seat for everyone and together, we move forward." Images of smiling, diverse passengers were plastered across screens and billboards, a stark contrast to the reality Margaret Brown had exposed. The public, however, was not convinced. Activists, emboldened by Margaret's courage, quickly called out the campaign as nothing more than a shallow attempt at damage control. Posts flooded social media, dissecting the company's history of ignoring complaints and failing to act on discriminatory practices. The hashtag actions not ads gained traction, amplifying the demand for genuine reform. Margaret and her growing team of supporters, including Karen and the activists who had rallied around her, took a proactive approach. A press conference was organized in a local community center. The room was packed with journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. Cameras flashed as Margaret stepped up to the podium, her calm demeanor steady as ever. "We've all seen the company's recent campaign," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "And while I applaud their sudden interest in inclusivity, I can't help but wonder where this commitment was when countless complaints were ignored. Actions speak louder than words, and so far, their actions tell a very different story." Karen stood nearby, nodding in agreement as Margaret continued. "This isn't about one driver, one incident, or even one company. This is about a system that allows discrimination to thrive in the shadows. Until real changes are made, policies enforced, accountability upheld, these campaigns are just window dressing." The press conference was a resounding success, with Margaret's words resonating far beyond the room. Clips of her speech circulated online, sparking further outrage and galvanizing the movement. Support poured in from across the city and beyond. People shared their own stories of facing discrimination, finding strength in Margaret's defiance. She became a symbol of resistance, her image a rallying point for those demanding justice. Amid the growing backlash, the transit company made its next move. A formal statement was issued, expressing regret over the incident and announcing Joe Henderson's termination. The press release emphasized that the company does not tolerate discriminatory behavior and vowed to review internal policies to prevent similar incidents. But Margaret was not satisfied. Neither were her supporters. To them, firing Joe was an easy scapegoat, a way to deflect attention from the systemic issues at play. The announcement was met with skepticism, with many calling it an attempt to quell public outrage without addressing the root problem. The company then reached out to Margaret directly, offering to settle the matter out of court. The terms included a monetary payout and a vague promise to reevaluate company policies. Karen reviewed the offer and presented it to Margaret, her expression neutral. "They're trying to buy their way out of this," Karen said, placing the documents on the table. "It's a significant amount, but there's no guarantee they'll follow through on their promises." Margaret didn't hesitate. "I'm not interested in their money," she said firmly. "If I settle, they'll think they've won. This isn't about compensation, it's about change." Karen nodded, her respect for Margaret growing. "Then we keep fighting." The rejection of the settlement offer further fueled public support for Margaret. Her refusal to back down inspired others, and soon, rallies were organized in her honor. Crowds gathered outside transit company offices, holding signs that read "Justice for Margaret" and "No more empty promises." Activists demanded transparency, calling for specific reforms, mandatory anti-discrimination training for employees, an independent oversight committee, and public accountability for complaints. As the pressure mounted, Margaret continued to use her platform to speak out. She attended community meetings, gave interviews, and met with local leaders. Her days were filled with conversations about justice and equality, her voice unwavering even as the weight of the fight pressed down on her. The company's public relations team scrambled to regain control of the narrative. They doubled down on their advertising campaign, released detailed outlines of proposed policy changes, and announced plans to host town hall meetings. But the public's trust had been broken, and the road to redemption was steep. Margaret's resolve never wavered. She knew that firing Joe was only the beginning, a symbolic gesture that did little to address the larger problem. The fight for systemic reform was far from over, and she was determined to see it through. The turning point came during a televised interview with a prominent news anchor. Margaret sat across from him, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, her gaze steady. The anchor asked her why she continued to push for change even after Joe had been fired and the company had issued an apology. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I did. Firing one person doesn't fix the system that allowed this to happen. Until real reforms are implemented, until accountability becomes the standard, the fight isn't over." Her words resonated deeply, sparking another wave of support. People from all walks of life rallied behind her, their voices joining hers in a chorus demanding justice. As Margaret left the studio that evening, she was greeted by a small crowd of supporters. They cheered as she stepped into the street, their signs and chants a testament to the movement she had inspired. Margaret paused, taking in the sight. For the first time, she felt the weight of what she had accomplished, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told to stay silent. The fight was far from over, but Margaret knew she wasn't alone. Together, they were forcing a system to confront its failures, and in doing so, they were shaping a better future. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the final ruling. Every eye in the room was fixed on the bench, the tension palpable. Margaret sat with her hands clasped together, her posture steady despite the weight of the moment. Karen Smith, seated beside her, exuded quiet confidence, her notes neatly arranged but untouched. The judge's voice cut through the stillness, firm yet measured. The decision was clear. The transit company was found liable for its negligence, and Joe Henderson's discriminatory actions were officially condemned. The company was ordered to pay significant damages to Margaret, both as compensation and as a penalty for its failure to address systemic issues. Furthermore, the court mandated sweeping reforms within the organization, including mandatory anti-discrimination training, the establishment of an independent oversight committee, and a transparent process for handling passenger complaints. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The spectators exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief and satisfaction. Margaret exhaled slowly, her calm exterior betraying only a hint of the profound emotions she felt. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been told to accept less than they deserved. Joe Henderson was the last to speak. Called to address the court, he stood with slumped shoulders, his earlier defiance replaced by a subdued resignation. His voice was uneven as he admitted his mistakes, acknowledging the harm his actions had caused. He expressed regret, though it was unclear whether it stemmed from genuine remorse or the pressure of public scrutiny. Margaret listened intently but remained impassive. When asked if she had anything to say in response, she rose slowly and addressed the room with quiet dignity. "I've never sought revenge," she began, her voice steady but resonant. This was never about one person's actions, but about the system that allowed those actions to go unchecked. Today's ruling is a step forward, but it's only a beginning. True change takes time, effort, and commitment. And I intend to hold this system accountable for as long as it takes. Her words were met with a ripple of applause, restrained by the formal setting but heartfelt nonetheless. Margaret returned to her seat, her resolve unshaken. The fight was far from over, but this moment marked a crucial turning point. Outside the courthouse, the mood was jubilant. Supporters gathered in droves, their signs waving and their cheers echoing down the street. The media swarmed, capturing every moment as Margaret stepped onto the courthouse steps. She raised her hand to acknowledge the crowd, her expression one of gratitude tempered by determination. Reporters shouted questions, their microphones jostling for space. Margaret spoke briefly, her words measured. "This decision isn't just for me," she said. "It's for everyone who has ever been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. We've made progress today, but there's still so much work to be done." Her voice carried beyond the immediate crowd, amplified by the cameras and shared across countless screens. People from all walks of life watched and listened, inspired by her courage and commitment. As the crowd began to disperse, Karen joined Margaret, her hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You've done something extraordinary," she said. "But I have to ask, what's next?" Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "I've been invited to speak at a few schools and universities," she said. "I think it's important for young people to understand that change doesn't happen overnight. It takes people willing to stand up and say, 'Enough.'" Karen nodded. "And beyond that?" Margaret's gaze sharpened. "I'm not done. This fight isn't over, but I need a moment to catch my breath. It's been a long journey." Karen's respect for Margaret deepened as she nodded. "Take the time you need. When you're ready, we'll keep going." In the weeks that followed, Margaret's name became synonymous with resilience and justice. She spoke at schools, community centers, and universities, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up for what was right. Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations about equality and accountability in unexpected places. The transit company, under the weight of public scrutiny, began implementing the reforms mandated by the court. Policies were rewritten, oversight committees were formed, and employees underwent rigorous training. Progress was slow, but it was tangible, a testament to the power of persistence. Margaret watched these changes unfold with a mix of satisfaction and caution. She knew that real change required vigilance and that complacency could undo even the most hard-won victories. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. The battle had taken its toll, but it had also shown her the strength of a community united by a shared purpose. As she stood on the porch of her modest home, gazing out at the horizon, her phone buzzed with a message from Karen. "The fight continues, but today, we celebrate. Thank you for your courage." Margaret smiled softly, her heart full. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of hope, a hope that, with enough voices and enough determination, the world could change. Months passed, and the impact of Margaret's fight rippled through the community like a stone cast into still water. The transit company, under the watchful eyes of activists and the public, had no choice but to deliver on its promises. Training programs on inclusivity and anti-discrimination became mandatory for all employees. A newly formed oversight committee, comprised of diverse community members, began reviewing complaints and ensuring accountability. Margaret followed the developments with cautious optimism. Each policy change, each report of progress, was a testament to the power of collective action. Her days were now filled with speaking engagements at schools, community centers, and activist meetings. Wherever she went, her message was clear: the fight for justice never ends, and everyone has a role to play. Her story had inspired an entire generation. Young people, moved by her courage and determination, flocked to activist movements. Social media buzzed with campaigns for equality, environmental justice, and education reform. Margaret became a symbol, not just of resistance but of hope, proof that ordinary people could create extraordinary change. Among the voices joining the chorus was Joe Henderson. Months after his dismissal, he made a surprising public appearance. In a short, carefully crafted video, Joe issued a formal apology, acknowledging his behavior and its consequences. His voice was steady but tinged with regret as he admitted, "I was wrong. I let my bias dictate my actions, and I hurt someone who deserved respect and dignity. I'm sorry." The apology sparked a whirlwind of reactions. Some viewed it as genuine, a man trying to rebuild his life after a fall from grace. Others dismissed it as a hollow gesture, too little, too late. Margaret listened to his words with quiet reflection but chose not to comment publicly. For her, the focus was never on him. It was on the broader change that his actions had inadvertently set in motion. The youth's energy fueled the movement, and Margaret often found herself speaking to packed auditoriums of bright, determined faces. At one event, a young woman approached her afterward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Because of you," she said, "I'm not afraid to stand up anymore." Margaret clasped her hands and replied softly, "Then I've done my job." One crisp afternoon, Margaret found herself at a bus stop. The scene was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded months earlier. The transit company had painted a new mural on the side of the nearby bus depot, a vibrant, colorful depiction of unity and equality, with the words, "Stronger Together," emblazoned beneath it. People passing by recognized her and stopped to chat, their words filled with gratitude and admiration. A young boy offered her a flower, saying his mother had told him about the lady who changed everything. An older man, who had been silent during the fateful bus ride, shook her hand firmly and said, "Thank you for standing when the rest of us Saturday." As Margaret waited, she reflected on how far they had come. The path had been long and difficult, and the fight wasn't over. There were still challenges to face, injustices to confront, and voices to amplify. But sitting there, surrounded by a community that had found its strength, she felt something profound, hope. When the bus arrived, the driver, a young woman with a kind smile, nodded respectfully to Margaret as she stepped on board. The passengers inside greeted her warmly, some standing to offer her a seat, a gesture that brought a small smile to her face. Before boarding, Margaret turned to the people gathered around her. Her voice, though quiet, carried a weight that demanded attention. "When we stand together, we become stronger," she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Never stay silent in the face of injustice." Her words hung in the air like a promise, one that everyone present seemed to take to heart. The bus pulled away, leaving the stop quieter but somehow brighter, the people standing there emboldened by the legacy of one woman's fight.